Thank you very much for being on our show.
How's it going? I'm Jake Stewart. I play guitar and keys for Thieves of Sunrise. I've been with the band for about 3 or 4 years now, and in that time we've done a West Coast tour and an East Coast tour, actually 2 East Coast tours and a couple Midwest tours. And right now we're on our West Coast tour. We're playing in Seattle, we're playing in Portland, Oregon. We're traveling kind of all up that Pacific Northwest area, and we're coming back. We're promoting right now our new singles. We recorded 2 tracks called I Walk Away and Save Me Tonight in Nashville, Tennessee. We recorded them 100% live, 100% analog, direct to vinyl disc. And that was at Welcome to 1979 Studios, and the engineer there was Chris Mara. And right now, we're promoting our Shake the Moon tour. This is our tour poster. If you want to check out the band, these are all of our links right here. Yeah, we're having fun on tour. We're excited to be out, and we're excited to bring our music to more people. We've got a lot of new material coming out. We're planning on doing a soul record of about 7 to 9 tracks pretty soon, and then we have plans to do a psychedelic record coming out. Our 2 past records, we've got one called Revolution that was recorded before I was in the band, and that includes all the original members of Thieves of Sunrise. And our most recent record's called Soul Stew, and I was on that record. Sean Crawford played guitar, Curtis Crawford played bass. We had 2 drummers on that record. We had Chris Petro from Denton, Texas, and we've got Miles Mathewson. They both played drums on that record. Matthew McDaniel's our vocalist, harmonica and guitar. And that record's got an eclectic mix of songs from gospel to blues and rock and soul. So
we're happy to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. We're happy to be here in Seattle playing for you lovely folks, and we're excited to play tonight.
Well, thanks for inviting Public Interest Issue.
Awesome. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Just a little bit. Hope y'all are ready for some jamming. Go on. This is our one and only cover that we played, but we put it on a record, so we figured that was alright. Mr. Levi and Helm's family said we could. And we come from down there on that third coast. A groove, a little funk, a little step into your lives on this one. We want to see you shaking some legs. style for you coming up next. Hope y'all ready to go to church. In Texas, they go to church on Wednesday night, and it is Wednesday night, so. Say it was her birthday, and she says, "Matthew, what's that song about? I really like it. It's one of my newest favorite ones off y'all's new record." And I said, "It's about sex and drugs, Mom." She's like, "Yeah, I pretty much figured that." So here it is. So we got up here this morning, and we drove around the blocks a few times. It happens sometimes when you're in a tour bus going through downtown. But I think we finally landed it after a mirror or two got hit. It's okay. We fixed it. It's not over, but this song is about being over. Since then, it had to stop. We can't say that we're promised it's going to rain. I don't know if y'all are looking for that here. But we saw in the forecast it's supposed to rain anyway, so we're not going to claim it just this one time, okay? Anywhere else we would claim it. Not here, though.
So thanks for watching Public Interest Issue. Today we had Thieves of Sunrise on. And they have a wonderful new CD. As this is editing, I'm going to talk to you about what's happening. Now, the reason why all of these different things are linked is because Michael Longyear, who is an attorney in Seattle, he handles trusts and different things like that. And Julie Schizzle, she was involved in the Robert Hamlin case. Robert Hamlin was in a guardianship. And during the time period that Robert Hamlin was in a guardianship, Dan Smirkin removed joint account money from Avis and Robert Hamlin's account. And he removed the money without a court order, and he put it into an account at the same bank under a different name so that nobody could get a hold of it. And then Avis had to, file a request to get the money back. And it was done kind of unhandedly, and it took a long time to get the money back. And the reason why that's significant is because there's a few other cases where that kind of situation occurred. In another case where it was a meretricious relationship, and Catherine and Charles Wiggins were involved, Charles Wiggins knew that tax returns in that case were not correct for the pro forma for the client because those tax returns had never been mailed in. And the same is true on the Dorothy Grega case. On the Dorothy Grega case, there were tax returns from the 2004-2005 Grega Charitable Trust that was established in 1996. And I kept saying to the attorneys, you've got to amend those tax returns. Because Ron Hansen, who is an accountant up in Edmonds, Donna Mae Curley and Dorothy Grega went up to Ron Hansen a few times. And they went up there and Ron Hansen told them that the tax return that they had a copy of from Richard Gregoric and BDO, the IRS didn't have any record of that entity with the EIN number. And so that would have to be amended. And the problem with amending it is those tax returns that BDO and Richard Gregoric gave Dorothy Grega, they had never been physically mailed to the IRS. So all of the Oppenheimer stocks and all of the assets that are listed on those charitable trusts for 1996 tax returns, all of those were just made up. It was all fictitious. BDO and Richard Gregoric, when they handed it to her, all of those things weren't true. And Ron Hansen, who was the accountant, told us, I was present when he told us, that the EIN number used on that tax return for the 1996 Grega Charitable Trust, that EIN number on those tax returns that was signed by BDO and signed by Dorothy Grega, that EIN number was fictitious. It wasn't a real EIN number that went with the fraudulent charitable trust. So it was a fraudulent EIN number and a fictitious charitable trust name on those tax returns. And that's why when I told Michael Longyear and Sally Lanham that they had to correct those tax returns, that's why they never did correct those. They never corrected them because they knew that they were never filed. And there was no EIN number issued by the U.S. government for an EIN tax entity called the Grega Charitable Trust of Stephen and Dorothy Grega for 1996. So if they had sent that in to amend it, it would have created a tax audit because nothing was ever done in the past on that. Richard Gregoric put his daughter Lorraine on as the third-party beneficiary on the Grega Living Trust that they established in 2004 with the same EIN number that they'd listed for the Grega Charitable Trust. And they never did anything with that except for when they went to the bank, BDO and Victoria Salas went to Bank of America in Kirkland, and they had opened a bank account for the Stephen and Dorothy Grega Charitable Trust of 1996. They opened it up with the same EIN number that was listed on tax returns for 2004 and 2005, which was fictitious. And the bank documents are all fraudulent too, because the bank documents show an EIN number that is fictitious for the Grega, Stephen and Dorothy Grega Charitable Trust of 1996, which was not a legitimate tax identity because it never was established with an EIN number. So the funny thing is that Donna Mae Curley, Dorothy Grega, and I went in 2007 to that Kirkland bank because in Mercer Island, they would not give Dorothy Grega any of the money in that charitable trust. And there was at least $200,000 in that charitable trust. And it was administered by Victoria Salas, BDO, and they withdrew from any operation of that charitable trust, so nobody was administering that trust. And so at the time, Donna Mae Curley and Dorothy Grega went in with me to Bank of America in Kirkland, and the bank manager allowed them to close that account, and they gave the money to Dorothy Grega. Dorothy appointed her daughter as trustee of that Grega Charitable Trust. At the time, she thought it was a legitimate trust with a legitimate EIN number, and Donna Mae Curley was directed by her mother to pay on the reverse mortgage that Richard Gregoric had set up. At the time that there was a reverse mortgage, before the reverse mortgage was established, for about 5 or 10 years, the same existing property had been set up as the Stephen and Dorothy Grega Charitable Trust asset. And it was changed over in the assessor's office. Everything was legitimate. They changed it from an individual asset of Stephen Grega and Dorothy Grega, and they changed it over to the Grega Charitable Trust asset. And at the time they changed it over, the only person that complained was Michelle Grega, who was the daughter of Stephen Grega had 9 children prior to marrying Dorothy Grega, and Dorothy Grega had 2 children. And Michelle Grega was the only one that objected to them moving that asset into the charitable trust. Now, Michelle Grega is one of the people that would have an interest in that asset because they legitimately didn't change it over properly, and it wasn't a legitimate asset because it was never identified as an EIN number with the IRS, and they never paid separate tax for the charitable trust that they had set up. And when Richard Gregoric changed it, and he was the one that did the paperwork, and he's the one that notarized it for Dorothy Grega only, and when he notarized it and changed it over to a Dorothy Grega asset, Stephen Gregoric was on the title. And so they changed it over to just a Dorothy Grega asset only. And the problem was Stephen Grega had 9 children. And none of the 9 children got any inheritance from that transaction. And the thing is that Richard Gregoric knew when he changed the property over so that she could get a reverse mortgage from Financial Freedom, he knew that it wasn't a legitimate asset. And he did the paperwork and gave it to Dorothy Grega and charged her for his legal time in creating the living trust and switching it over to that asset. He charged her for all of those transactions, when in fact, it wasn't a legal, legitimate transaction. And the funny thing about it is, when Dorothy Grega was living in her house in 2008, in 2007 in December, her son went into the hospital because there was a big storm and he had diabetes, and so he went into the hospital. Then by 2007, in 2007, Dan Curley, Dorothy Grega's son, was in Kindred Hospital. And when he was dying, the nurses there called Donna Mae Curley to come up and help her mother during this time period that her son was dying and that her brother was dying. And when Donna Mae Curley would come up and visit her mom, one time she yelled at her mom and said, "I hate you. I want you dead." And she just hated her mother, and I asked her, "Why don't you like your mom?" And she said, because her brother raped her, and her mother allowed her brother to live in that house with, Stephen Grega and Dorothy Grega. And so Donna Mae Curley hated her mother. And it was just amazing to me that she was just so vengeful and hated her mother. And so anyway, when her brother was dying, Dan Curley was dying at Kindred Hospital, she refused. I called her up and asked her, "Please come up and help your mom." She refused to come up and help her mom. And so the problem with that was 2 weeks after that, when her brother died, then she started the guardianship, freezed all of Dorothy Grega's assets, took them over, removed Dorothy Grega from her house, changed her phone number so nobody could get a hold of her. And I think this was deliberately done because the lawyers, Donna Mae Curley had been communicating with those lawyers prior to her brother's death. And Donna Mae Curley had already signed the power of attorney with Ron Hansen to amend the tax returns for the charitable trust. And at the time the charitable trust was established, there was a medical office in Redmond, a log cabin in Redmond, there were parking lots, there were houses, there were a lot of assets that were never accounted for to the IRS. And at the time, Donna Mae Curley knew that Dorothy Grega and I had contacted the IRS, Pat in Anchorage, Alaska, and Pat said, "Don't worry, I'm sending you all of the tax returns for Dorothy to sign so we can update everything." And at the time, Pat in Alaska had no record whatsoever of these tax returns that we were talking about for the charitable trust that had Oppenheimer stock on them and had all this listed of assets. And at the time, Pat in Anchorage said that all she could find for assets for Dorothy Grega was the assets that she won at gambling at the Muckleshoot casino. Dorothy would win 20 or 30,000 a year at the casino, and she put every penny that she earned from that on her tax returns. And Pat at the IRS knew about that, but she didn't know anything about the money from either the Bank of America, 200,000, from the Kirkland Bank that had the charitable trust as its identity. And so it was very interesting because Donna Mae Curley knew when she came up here and we closed that account for the 200,000 that that would be a tax liability for her mother and for her, because that was a charitable trust asset, and that was money, income, windfall that went to Dorothy Grega. And so nothing was ever paid for that to the IRS for the 2007 money that came from the Bank of America in Kirkland for that asset. And I think that's why Michael Longyear filed the guardianship with Donna Mae Curley at that time, because they knew that they had a tax liability for the 200,000 that they removed from Bank of America, but they also knew they had a tax liability going back to 1996 for that charitable trust asset, because no tax returns had ever been filed by Dorothy or Stephen Grega separately for that charitable trust asset. And now they had assets in that, and they had all sorts of money that was never accounted for. And when the house was sold in 2008, Dorothy Grega died in 2008. There was a guardianship going on, and after she died, there was a probate going on. And when she died, it was said by different people that the house was bought by a friend of the lawyers. And the reason why that's significant is because the guardianship never accounts for the $1.3 million for the sale of the house. And in the probate, Donna Mae Curley signs an affidavit with the court, signed under penalty of perjury, that she only made $100,000 from her mother's estate, and no other heirs were given any money. The Stephen Grega heirs all sued the Grega Charitable Trust, and they lost that lawsuit because there wasn't any Grega Charitable Trust. And the funny thing about the fact that that $1.3 million for the sale of the house was never accounted for, and that the Grega Charitable Trust of 1996 never had a legitimate tracing of any of the money in that estate. The interesting thing about that is that the Arthur Hayes case is another similar case. And in that case, Arthur Hayes' Hayes LLC, Michael Longyear, the same attorney who represented Dorothy Grega and has not accounted for the $1.3 million for the sale of her property in Mercer Island, Michael Longyear is also the guardian in the Arthur Hayes case. And as of the last few years, and currently, Michael Longyear has been submitting all sorts of attorney fee cost bills and everything else. And I've heard that as much as $900,000 is going for attorney fees or whatever, I don't know. But I heard that some of the assets of the Hayes LLC were liquidated, and that those assets have not been accounted for in the tax returns, and that Arthur Hayes' tax returns aren't current, and the Hayes LLC's tax returns aren't current, and that there's never been any accounting for all of these properties that are being liquidated in the guardianship with Arthur Hayes. And that the problem with that is that during the time period of all of that, Michael Longyear knew that there was tax liability for selling those things, because those things were in Mr. Arthur Hayes and his wife's estate, and his wife died, and then they were in his property, and he's got LLCs, And Michael Longyear is the manager of the LLCs and the member of the LLCs. So Michael Longyear is technically the only person that I think that could do the tax returns. And those tax returns for those properties that are being sold have not been accounted for. You know, there's no tax return for that. There's horrible tax liability, and that hasn't been addressed in a tax return that's sent in and filed by the IRS. Another case is Charles Wiggins, who is a judge in the Supreme Court of the state of Washington. On the Dorothy Grega case, the case got sent up to the Court of Appeals and then to the Washington State Supreme Court. And when it was in the Washington State Supreme Court, I requested that Charles Wiggins recuse himself because of a case I was personally involved in, that he was involved in. And in the case that I was aware of with Charles Wiggins, he extorted money out of a company, and he was aware of the fact that the tax returns for the liability that were submitted in that case were fraudulent tax. And the people on the side I was on had to pay tax on tax and tax on tax on tax for obligation that wasn't a legitimate obligation. And the proof that they gave were tax returns that weren't real tax returns. They were never sent into the IRS, and they were pro forma, or they were fictitious tax returns, just like in the Dorothy Grega case. And just like in the Arthur Hayes case, you know, they're not doing the taxes right. And so Charles Wiggins, instead of recusing himself in that case because of my prior knowledge of him, he decided that he was going to dismiss that case. And so that case went up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the attorney opposing me in the U.S. Supreme Court was Gregory Miller. Well, Gregory Miller in the Court of Appeals said that he represented Dorothy Grega. But how can you represent somebody when you've never talked to that person, period, in your life? Dorothy Grega never had a conversation with Gregory Miller, and Gregory Miller never sent her invoices. He sent the invoices to Sally Lanham, who was Donna Mae Curley's lawyer, the daughter, who had an interest and a conflict of interest. And so the thing is that all of these different things and stuff, and Charles Wiggins was involved in the other case where he knew that there weren't legitimate tax returns, and Charlie Wiggins was involved in the Dorothy Grega case. And so you seem to have the same lawyers, and like Larry Jordan, who was a judge in the other case, he knew that the tax returns that were submitted as a tax liability obligation was not a legitimate obligation. And he knew that Gail McElroy was seizing money from Bank of America without a court order. She just went in there and got $300,000, then she got another $300,000, and then we were flying in from Puerto Rico, and while the house was closing, Gail McElroy seized the escrow account of $237,000 from the sale of the house for a tax liability that wasn't a legitimate tax liability. So Charles Wiggins was aware of the fact that all of those things were fraudulent transactions by those lawyers. And this case came up again in the Grega case when I was communicating with all the lawyers in a deposition. And so the thing is that they were all aware of the fraud, they were all aware of the fraudulent tax returns, they were all aware of the fact that they were defrauding us, and they were all aware of the fact that they were threatening and intimidating. Sally Lanham assaulted me in court, and she threatened and intimidated me. Catherine Smith, when I was over there and telling her she was defrauding my friend, she grabbed my hair and pulled it. She pulled it in the elevator all the way down to the 5th floor, and then she screamed and yelled at me. And there were all these attorneys standing around, and nobody did anything to help. But Catherine Smith knew that it was all fraudulent at the time, and that she was conspiring and working with Charles Wiggins and working with Gail McElroy. And Sally Lanham and Michael Longyear, those people all asked me, you know. And the thing is, they all knew that whole situation was fraudulent, and they all knew What they did on the Dorothy Grega case was all fraudulent. And what they're doing right now on the Arthur Hayes case is all fraudulent, because they are accessing huge amounts of money and they're not accounting for it. In the Dorothy Grega case, there was a tax levy going on. And that's the reason why we called Pat in Anchorage, Alaska. There was a tax levy going on, and Partners in Care removed the money from Washington Mutual during a tax levy. And the woman, Pat, at the IRS said, were you guys doing it to defeat the levy? And we said, no, we had nothing to do with it. And Partners in Care never returned the money to Dorothy Grega that they took from her bank account. And the thing is that in all of these different situations, the one common thread between them all, Carlos Valategui, who is a commissioner downtown, he's involved in a lot of these guardianship cases. You know, he jokes about, oh, there's 6 or 7 lawyers representing this case, and they're all going to get paid from this case. You know, he jokes about how all of these different cases are going to make all these lawyers rich, as he's talking to bill collectors on the phone at the bench as he's waiting for another hearing. And the thing is, Carlos Valategui knew that these tax returns were fraudulent and that they were pro forma and they weren't legitimate. And Carlos Valategui finally ruled that Avis Hamlin should get the money back that Dan Smirkin removed without a court order. But it wasn't before she had to pay additional attorney fees from the Court of Appeals. And the thing is that we've got a really big problem here with these attorneys who are in a lot of power taking advantage of these elderly people and their estates when they have all sorts of money, or in these domestic cases when they have all sorts of money. You know, the other case was Meretricia's case that they, Charles Wiggins, Gail McElroy, Catherine Smith, Sally Lanham asked me about those in the deposition, and so she's associated with it, you know. And so the problem is that they intimidate and they threaten. They've intimidated and threatened me. Gail McElroy threatened me during that case, and Catherine Smith pulled my hair and assaulted me, and then Sally Lanham, she assaulted me in court, physically assaulted me in court. And she kept bringing me back to court and intimidating and threatening me. You know, it was appalling, the intimidations and threats. And so I'm bringing this all to the public because Lane Powell Miller was involved in the Lillian Robinson case, and Lane Powell Miller was involved in the Harry Plattis and Donald L. Hubbard case, where the money got embezzled by Craig S. Palmquist. And Lane Powell Miller was also involved in the Dorothy Grega case because one of the people that was represented by Lane Powell Miller was the trustee for the Grega Trust when they were running things before that, when John Selby was administering, putting all the property into those charitable trust assets. And so you've got a similarity of all these different lawyers, and you've got a similarity of all these sales of homes that are not accounted for in either the guardianship or in the probate. And you've got a similarity of deliberately failing to keep the taxes up to date. And in the Grega case, they just used fictitious EIN numbers and fraudulent charitable trust names. And they never corrected Dorothy Grega's tax returns for the $200,000 she made in 2007 and for the $1.3 million she made in 2008, which was capital gains. It was ordinary income that should have been charged at 38%. And so I am a whistleblower, and I am trying to get the U.S. Attorney to be interested in this case because I think the situations of the intimidation and threat, I think this raises to the level of a federal RICO case because you've got similar attorneys like Michael Longyear was involved in Dorothy Grega. Michael Longyear is involved in Arthur Hayes. Michael Longyear just went to court about 2 weeks ago and got additional money for his attorney fees in the Arthur Hayes case, and yet he's liquidating assets. He liquidated one piece of property to a lobbyist that they know, and in the Dorothy Grega case, that house sold to a friend of the attorneys, and in the Ray and Susan Finner case, their property in Friday Harbor went to a judge. In the case of Ray and Susan Finner, their property got liquidated for a Gary Gaffner loan, and it got liquidated up in Friday Harbor, and it got sold, and there's a living trust on one of them. And the other piece, it's a judge that bought it. And if you look at the records up there on Susan and Ray Finner that got defrauded up in Friday Harbor, you see that there's a sheriff's sale. Well, I asked the sheriff if there was a sheriff's sale, and he said, no, we never sold that property in a sheriff's sale. And then you look at the documents, and it shows $1 for a piece of property. And it shows really strange transactions, and it shows that they borrowed $1 million up there, but they never got the $1 million. And the property up there, it's a judge owns it now for the transaction of Ray and Susan Finner up in Friday Harbor. And so you've got all these different coincidences of all these different properties, and Charles Wiggins, who's on the Washington State Supreme Court, he's involved in 2 of these cases. He's involved in the other case, which was a meretricious relationship, and he's involved in Dorothy Grega's case. And in Dorothy Grega's case, he had a real conflict of interest, and instead of recusing himself from being able to rule in that case, and he wasn't even assigned to be one of the judges in the case, he went in and he took over the case, dismissed the case, and he was the one that ruled on the cases, which is horribly a conflict of interest, and judicial misconduct, judge misconduct. And I reported all of these attorneys to the Bar Association, and I reported these judges. I think Larry Jordan should be in jail. He was a judge, now he's an arbitrator. I think Charles Wiggins, who is a Supreme Court justice, should be in jail for what he's done. And Michael Longyear, I totally think he should be in jail for his improper handling of the Arthur Hayes case and the Dorothy Grega case, and the fact that in the Dorothy Grega case, he knew that the tax returns were fraudulent, and he deliberately did nothing to correct anything, and he knows that there's a tax liability, and so it's either laundered money or it's tax fraud. And it's also a federal RICO because there's 3 conspirators. It takes 2 people to conspire to defraud the U.S. government. And when you're defrauding the U.S. government like this, that's a federal RICO. And so this is my letter to, my email is coming, but this is my letter to Fred Good of the Seattle FBI. They asked me to do an email, and this is my follow-up video, and I'll do the email, but this is why I think the U.S. Attorney should get involved in the Michael Longyear case, because I think there is significant civil, federal, and criminal federal RICO, and that this case should be investigated, and that these people should be brought to justice. They are not above the law. And Dorothy Grega died, and let's hope that Arthur Hayes stays alive to see justice. I had lunch with him the other day. He's a wonderful old man, and he should have dignity in his old age, and he should not be deprived of his livelihood, all his properties, and Michael Longyear should not be allowed to be the member of his LLC, the manager of his LLC, and the guardian of his estate. He didn't want to be the guardian of Arthur Hayes. He wanted to be the guardian of the $20 million estate, which I think, somebody should look into this. So I'm Janet Christensen O'Brien. I'm a TV producer over here. My show is called Public Interest Issue Show. I've done a series of shows now to help you understand each segment of this and to help you understand the patterns. But thank you very much for watching Seattle Community Media TV. It's because of them that I'm able to have this show come to you. And if you have information that you want to have on a TV show, Seattle Community Media is a wonderful place to get your story on the air. So thank you. And I'm doing a show right now on a band. So sometimes I film bands, sometimes I film important issues that the public wants me to know about. And whoever it is that sent me those documents about Michael Longyear using improper authority to seal files, thank you very much for sending that to me, and thank you for sending me all the other material from all the other attorneys. I appreciate that tremendously, and please keep sending me materials. If you've got stuff, you can call me, 206-624-9624. I want to hear from you, and I think it's very important. I'm a private detective. My company is Seattle Detective Bureau, and I'm a human being. I'm a TV producer. I'm a whistleblower. My name is Janet Christensen O'Brien. I think it's very important that these attorneys have threatened, assaulted, intimidated me, and that this is a saga that has happened to me personally. And I talked to Charles Wiggins and I asked him to do something about this. And then I asked for him to be recused, and he continued to do nothing. I think these attorneys should be disbarred. I think the Bar Association has an obligation to do something to protect the public. I brought this to the Bar Association's attention, and they've continued to do nothing to protect the public. Gary Reese and Howard Pellet worked for 8 years to get something done about Craig S. Palmquist, and they worked diligently, and IRS Howard Pellet filed 8 counts of fraud against Craig S. Palmquist when he embezzled money as a partner at Lane, Palomos, Miller. So things really do happen, and just hold your breath, because there are people out there that are honest and they want to do their job. And so I'm just asking them to do their job. And I appreciate Fred Goot for all the work he's done throughout the years. He was introduced to me by Gary Reese, U.S. Customs, when Gary and Howard had finished the Craig S. Palmquist case, and Fred was working on a University of Medical School Medicaid, Medicare fraud case that was handled and had a whistleblower involved in it. And I'm a whistleblower too. And this is a big public interest issue show. And thank you, thank you, thank you. Now let me show you the other show I just uploaded, so you'll see that immediately, but I'm going to walk over here and show you on the screen. So this is my other show that I'm working on. I was talking about that today as well. And this is the other show that I just finished editing. And that's me, Public Interest Issue Show. So thanks for watching Public Interest Issue. This is a very significant issue that the attorney, Michael Longyear, has sold Dorothy Craig's house for $1.3 million, and it is not being recorded on the tax returns. It's not in the guardianship. It's not in the probate. And this kind of thing is also happening on the Arthur Hayes case. They just got more attorney fees awarded to them, and they have been selling off his assets in his LLC, Hayes LLC, out there on Elliott Avenue, and there's no tax returns to account for all the tax liability from the sale of these properties, which is going to be significant. So thank